Namaste. Salam alaikum. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and good night, friends all around the globe. I'm Radha Paudel, founder and CEO of Global South Coalition for Dignified Menstruation, based in Secretariat Office of Global South Coalition in Nepal. As you all know, it is a global network for changing narratives around menstruation from hygiene to dignity and from 5 days leading to life cycle approach. To us, Global South Coalition for Dignified Menstruation has been trying to educate the global community in different levels through research, policy advocacy, campaign, and initiating and marking the December 8th as an International Dignified Menstruation Day. First, let me share the housekeeping. This discussion or webinar is divided into 3 parts. First, I will introduce 3 individuals, Sarah, Joan, and Ninamma. Second, Sarah will present about the issue, and simultaneously Joan will interpret from English to French. Those who like to get the French interpretation, please click the interpretation and choose the language, either English, original one, or French. After the presentation, Ninamma will moderate the question answer session. And I humbly request to all of you be muted throughout the session. If you have anything, please write in the chat box. Please introduce yourself in a chat box. Your name, your organization, your country. If you like to share your contact address or email, please drop there. And if you have any questions for Sarah or Global South Coalition, please drop in the chat box, write in chat box. And if you are watching through the Facebook page of Global South Coalition for Dignified Menstruation, please write comment or question in comment section. Our colleagues will collect and ask with the presenter. And now, let me introduce our speaker. Today's speaker is Sarah Green, all the way from New York, USA. She woke up early today for this interaction. Thank you so much, Sarah, for accommodating us. We really appreciate your commitment for the cause. She is a consultant in the areas of international human rights with the focus of gender justice and sexual and reproductive rights. She chairs the Child, Early and Post-Marriage and Sexuality Working Group, a group of over 20 international and national organizations working to drive more or better resources to gender transformative approaches to preventing child, early and forced marriage and advocating girls' and women's rights. She has worked in advocacy, research, program and communication roles of American Jewish World Service, UNICEF, UNFPA, and other international organizations. She will present for about 20 minutes, then we will have a question and answer session. And then for interpretation, we have a very dynamic, multi-talented woman from all the way Canada. Her name is Joan Trappier. She has extensive experience in policymaking, partnership, program as a public service in Canada. Since 2008, she has been leading the several cooperation projects in Guatemala, Vietnam, Nepal. She is a former ambassador for Uruguay. She is a Rotarian as well. She is fluent in French, English, Spanish, and will soon start learning Nepali. Thank you very much, Joan. She is making stained glass and mosaic work of arts. She has extraordinary. capacity. And Nirama, who will be the moderator for the question and answer session, she has a Bachelor's of Social Work and Social Sciences from Bath University, UK. She is a dynamic, young, and passionate young adult. She recently joined Global South Coalition for Dignified Menstruation. And as you always know, the Lal Salaune is a IT person. He is hiding and managing us. Let's welcome to Sarah and let's hear her presentation. Sarah, floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Radha, for that nice introduction. And thank you everyone for joining today. And thank you for organizing this. Yes, I'm calling from early in New York City on a nice warm summer morning. You might see me still drinking my coffee. I hope that's okay. It's a pleasure to be here with you today. Like Radha said, I chair the Child Marriage and Sexuality Working Group. I just put the link to our website in the chat, and I can do that again a bit later. If you click on that and scroll down to the bottom, you can see all of the organizations that are part of this working group. The group was founded in 2016 out of a concern that there was not enough attention to an important driver of child marriage. And that driver is control of adolescent sexuality, in particular, girls' sexuality and also young women's sexuality. Through research and through listening to feminists in places where child marriage is prevalent, we learned that when girls hit puberty, families and communities start to have concerns and fears related to adolescent sexuality. And these concerns lead families and communities to try to control girls and their lives by restraining their movements, by limiting their options, and even arranging their early marriages. So this impulse shows up not just in communities and families, but also in institutions like schools, the healthcare system, and laws and policies. And I'm going to present more on that more specifically in just a moment. But the problem is the topic of girls' sexuality is taboo. So even when program implementers and advocates want to address it, they don't. It makes people feel uncomfortable, and even programs that try to do it can get shut down in communities. But on the other hand, if we don't address it, child marriage and all other violations of girls' and women's rights will continue. So as a working group, we wanted to draw more attention and support for this and use our platform to develop and share resources to support those who are doing the programming and advocacy, and also to encourage funders and donors to support this work and to support local feminist organizations because they are already doing the work of tackling social norm change in their local context on a number of issues. I'm sure many of you on the line right now are doing exactly that kind of work on the ground. So when the group was founded, the first thing we did was produce a report called Tackling the Taboo. And I'm going to put a link to that in the chat. And I'm sure you'll have access to all of this after the presentation too. You can see the Tackling the Taboo report. So this report, which we put out a few years ago, rounds up the experiences and insights of several organizations around the world who are doing this work of addressing control of sexuality within their child marriage programming. So the report describes their gender transformative approaches and promising practices. So the report drew a lot of attention to this issue. And when we talked to funders to ask them what we could do to support them to make the case within their own funding institutions to support these kinds of programs, they told us they wanted to see something more technical. They wanted a resource that made very clear the relationships and connections between social norms that lead to control of girls' bodies and choices, and how that links to child marriage. And importantly, what can be done to break that cycle. So we partnered with researchers at the Torchlight Collective, and we produced a conceptual framework that tries to do this. And so in addition to a literature review, the researchers and local organizations did focus groups with adolescent girls in Guatemala, India, and Niger as part of this research. And we also consulted practitioners and donors to get their views and inputs. So without further ado, I'm going to present some of these highlights of this conceptual framework. And while the framework doesn't really link to dignified menstruation explicitly, I think there's a lot for us to think about in here about how we show up for adolescent girls and what their needs are in this phase of life, linked to both dignified menstruation and child marriage. And so I think there will be some good points for discussion after I get through. So now I'm going to show you some slides. Hope everyone can see my screen okay. Thank you. So this is the Girls' Sexuality in Child, Early and Forced Marriage and Unions Conceptual Framework. So this image is a lot to take in. Don't be afraid, don't be scared. I'm not asking you to understand this. I just wanted to give you a comprehensive visual depiction of the conceptual framework. We're going to walk through the different pieces so that we can understand them better. But just to give you a sense of how the pieces fit together, that piece on the top, the words in the middle sort of shining out of the sun, that is the envisioned change. Then down the left side, the darker color, those are the drivers of child marriage, the social norms rooted in patriarchy that drive child marriage. And the piece on the right, the orange piece, those are the solutions. Those are how we can address that issue. So we'll go over those pieces in turn. So the first piece is the envisioned change. And I want to emphasize that we arrived at this change after talking to girls in the countries I mentioned, Guatemala, Niger, and India, and also doing wider research. And so in sum, I'm going to read the change. Girls in all their diversity are supported to express their sexuality inside and outside of marriage, and to freely develop life intentions and aspirations, including in relation to marriage and children. So one thing I just want to point out is while this is the envisioned change for child marriage work, we don't mention age of marriage. We don't mention just delaying marriage until after a certain age, like age 18. The change being envisioned is much broader and deeper than that, to really get at all of the different issues that pose problems for women and girls in their lives, which also lead to early marriage. So our goal is to push to address the root causes of child marriage and not just to delay the age in which it happens. I'm going to go over how the changes that the girls told us they wanted to see at the different levels of the socio-ecological model. So at the individual level, the relationship level, the community level, and then the societal level. On the right side of the screen, you'll see quotes from the girls. I'm not going to read those out, but we can also share out the presentation after today so you can read those more closely. So at the individual level, girls wanted to feel positively about their sexuality, have information to make decisions, and enjoy equitable relationships. They wanted to decide if, when, and whom to marry. The issue came up of how LGBTQI and gender nonconforming young people are and what their relationship is to child marriage and how they want to be supported to express and enjoy their identity and sexuality. And that girls want to feel free and safe to wear what they want and to go where they want and voice their opinions. Girls told us they get a lot of feedback on their choice of clothing and moving through their communities from their parents, and they wanted to be able to dress how they want and feel safe and free to do so. At the relationship level, the envisioned change is for parents to understand girls' sexual and reproductive rights and be supportive of their dreams and desires. And in engaging with men and boys so that they are supportive of equitable relationships across genders and understand the sexual and reproductive rights of girls, and that adolescent girls have a community of peers who support each other's desires and dreams. At the community level, the envisioned change is that schools and health services provide sexual and reproductive health and rights information to girls, that girls are respected as complete human beings with rights beyond marriage and motherhood, and that institutions see girls as rights bearers. And finally, at the societal level, the change envisioned is that power structures, institutions, and service providers no longer uphold inequitable norms. We're gonna see how those norms manifest in power structures in society in just a couple of slides. Laws and institutions support all consensual, sexual, and effective relationships between adolescents, including outside of marriage. That violence against women and girls is viewed as unacceptable, and that survivor-centered services are available. And girl-friendly services across health and education support girls' bodily autonomy and choices. So those are highlights of the change, the envisioned change. So now we're going to talk about some of the root causes of child marriage related to social norms. We know child marriage is a complex problem that has a lot of drivers, including poverty and other issues. The issues that the working group focuses on are how those gendered social norms drive child marriage and how those are often not explicitly addressed in programming. So that is what we really wanted to dig into with this conceptual framework. And this is part of the framework where we tried to show how norms, if you look on the left part, rooted in social hierarchy, patriarchy, and adultism, drive child marriage. And at the bottom, you see many programs do not address this issue head on. And as a result, as we move to the right, child marriage continues to persist. So despite the fact that there are lots of different child marriage programs out there, if they're not really addressing these gendered social issues, if they're not really addressing these norms, child marriage will continue despite all of our investments and efforts. So some of these norms that we found in our research directly with girls and also our literature review was norms around purity and family honor. For example, girls' sexuality or sexual activity and pregnancy outside of marriage reflects negatively on the girl and can bring shame upon the family. And for that reason, when girls hit puberty, parents want to avoid that possibility. And so they arrange for their daughters to get married to avoid the social shame of her having sex outside of marriage. That is a norm that is one of the drivers. And also the notion of protection and family responsibility. Parents might feel that they're supporting their daughter to feel safer and be less likely to be a victim of gender-based violence if she enters into marriage, and thus they arrange their marriage out, regardless of what the girl's wishes are. And also the norm that girls ought to obey their parents' decision for a partner. In many places, the norm is not that marriage is an individual choice, but rather something decided by the family. Other norms we found were around motherhood and adulthood. And one is the notion that in many societies, marriage and motherhood are inevitable for girls. Not an option, not something they can consider whether and when they want to do, but something that it is ultimately their destiny, and that's always what they are working towards. And that marriage, it really is how a girl becomes an adult, not through education, not through a profession, or not through some other way, but that marriage is the one and only sort of life happening that brings a girl into adulthood. And also the social norm that girls' primary role is at home, and to do the domestic work and to not have much of a life in the community or in any public way. We also dug into the heteronormativity of child marriage in the assumption in families and in society that all girls are heterosexual and that all girls want to marry in the first place. So these are sort of the norms that are also contributing to child marriage. And finally, I want to point to sexual harassment and violence. There are assumptions that all interactions between adolescent girls and boys are always romantic and always sexual, making it difficult for girls and boys to even spark friendships. And so those kind of friendships are discouraged and until and if it is time to marry. And also the girls are at fault if they're sexually harassed. And so I just want to point out that this framework shows how influential these norms are on girls' ability to express themselves. Keeping track of time. Radha, I know you'll tell me if you want. I have a handful of more slides, but just ping me when you know you want me to wrap up. I will go through this next section a bit quickly. We found that these social norms that exist in families and communities are also exist in institutions and laws and policies, and those norms are being reinforced there. So we don't need to go into it in detail, but I just want to point out that it's not just the people that are closest to the girl, but it's in places like schools, the health system. For example, from the legal side, there are many protectionist laws that regulate sexual and gender identities and sexual consent, and that especially laws related to child marriage that really just focus on age of marriage without really considering girls' evolving capacities, without considering girls' agency, and that are taking punitive approaches, sometimes towards the young people themselves, sometimes towards their parents and communities for marrying the girls in ways that are not always yielding the best outcomes for girls and their families. These laws also impact girls, and especially unmarried girls' ability to access sexual and reproductive health services. Just to focus on education, often in families where they're concerned about poverty and economics, girls' education is one of the first things that goes on the chopping block. Girls are pulled out of school and kept home to work at home. And so their educational opportunities are curtailed. Girls have trouble accessing the health system, especially unmarried girls, especially around sexual and reproductive health. So that's just to give you an overview of some of the norms that are both close to girls and in the institutions that surround them, that control their limit their agency, limit their freedom, and also drive child marriage. The good news is there are solutions, and I'm just going to give a couple of highlights because I know we're almost at the 20 minutes. And I would really encourage you, if you're interested in this, to take a closer look at the conceptual framework. But what we really wanted to put forward is the solutions to addressing these social norms involve three core ideas: gender transformative approaches, core programming principles, and change makers. So I'll give you a quick sense of what those are. And those are underpinned by principles of gender justice, sexual and reproductive justice, and human rights. The point we want to make here is that typically a lot of child marriage programming has had the goal of simply delaying age of marriage and without really addressing the root causes. What does that mean? For example, you might implement a cash transfer program that is incentivizing families to not marry their daughters until age 18. So every month or every so often, the family gets cash or some other sort of, valuable commodity that incentivizes them to not arrange their daughters' marriages. But what research has shown is that if you only do the cash transfer program without addressing all of the other social norms aspects of child marriage, girls get married at age 18 in a day. And it doesn't mean that they have chosen their partner. It doesn't mean that that relationship is a safe and nonviolent relationship. That doesn't mean they get to have control over whether or not and when to have children or work outside the home. And so we run the risk of really investing in more superficial solutions that give us the indicator of girls get married later without really addressing the root causes. And so that's basically, in sum, what a gender transformative approach is. The gender transformative approach wants to get into these social norms issues, wants to get into the power dynamics that exist between girls and their families in the larger society. And programs that are transformative really seek to address all of these. And I won't read this list of bullets, but the general point is gender transformative approaches, or GTAs, are essentially political. They are seeking to redistribute power and really enhance the position of women and girls and other marginalized groups relative to others in their communities. And that is tricky and sensitive work. And the conceptual framework does list some sorts of programs that can address some of these issues that you see listed here, but it doesn't prescribe a particular program package. I think programmers who are on the ground working in their local communities are best placed to understand exactly what programs and what strategies reach girls. But with these aims in mind. So for example, we talk about girls' collectives, which bring girls together to understand gender and sexuality and other social issues in their lives and learn how to both challenge social norms in their own lives, like in their families, and also band together to take collective action within their communities on issues that are important to them. Intergenerational dialogues with members, with families and members of the community that really bring up these issues and really sort of, challenge the community to think about what they are doing to limit girls and young women's freedom. And all of these, would really, those approaches need to be done in ways that are really contextualized and really localized and really being led by feminist organizations that are local, that really understand what the norms and what the risks are. And this, you may be very familiar with this gender continuum that really walks us through the difference between a program that is, even perhaps harmful with regards to gender, or sort of neutral in the middle, not challenging gender norms at all. And what we're encouraging is to get to all the way to the right, where programs are gender transformative, they're really leading with that in mind. And just another example before we conclude could be, for example, a sexuality education program. We all know about comprehensive sexuality education, which really deals with not just the science of sex, but also the social aspects of sex, safety and gender diversity, and how to have sex safely, not just encouraging abstinence. That would be on the gender transformative side, versus a sexuality education program that just gives biological information and encourages abstinence. That would not be gender transformative. So that's the sort of distinction that we're trying to make. And just before I close, we also have some core principles for programming, such as centering the voices of girls, being comprehensive, multi-level and multi-component, intersectional and inclusive, dialogue-based, and involves change makers at all levels of the socio-ecological model. And while we're not going to get into the specific recommendations that we have with all stakeholders, one advocacy point for the working group is always to encourage funders who are interested in child marriage, who want to support this issue, to learn more about gender transformative approaches, to learn more about what it means to invest in child marriage beyond just focusing on age of marriage, and really getting those resources to the feminist organizations on the ground that have been working to change social norms for girls and women on all kinds of issues. And they're the organizations that really get it, and they're always the ones that are underfunded. So for child marriage donors, those organizations need your support, and we hope this resource is helpful to you to understand that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Radha. It's really inspiring, and you are giving the other side of the issue. Like child marriage is itself very complex, very multifaceted. And if we see the history, it is already about century. Since 1928, the Sada Act from India started to work on ending child marriage. And still we are struggling, and many countries, including Nepal, is counted as a high rate of child marriage country in the global map, and which is really sad. Let's
Radha, if I could just say if I could just follow up what you just said, just pointing out how longstanding this issue is. That is also despite laws that prohibit child marriage in some of the places you just named. And that is something that I find interesting, and the working group is focusing on that issue now. Or what age of marriage laws, how helpful are they? Are they harmful? How can we make laws work better? Because as you said, these issues have been long-standing, despite very clear laws prohibiting child marriage. So I just wanted to close with that.
Yeah, we have to see the child marriage in a systemic approach, not linear approach. Let's hear from Ninamma what kind of questions she received, and if required, we'll come back.
Sure. Thank you, Radha. Thank you. Thank you, first of all, Sarah, for such a informative PowerPoint presentation. Definitely, I think I speak on behalf of everyone that is very knowledgeable and very eye-opening for, especially for individuals who've come across child marriage in such a in-depth way for the first time. So just to let everybody know, we'll be moving on to the question and answer segment. If anybody has any questions, please just type it up in the chat box and I will be happy to read them out. We do have one from Radha herself. Let's start off with that one. How do girls discuss about sexuality if they do not know about their bodily function like menstruation?
That's such a good question. Should I answer that one? Okay,
Yeah,
great.
Yeah.
No, that's such a good question, and that's exactly the barrier, because sexuality is taboo, and that directly links to what is happening with girls' bodies when they enter puberty, because even these simple biological functions are sort of taboo to even, I mean, we know about the stigma related to menstruation in some communities and some societies. Not only are girls not given just the material supplies that they need to manage their periods, but in some cases they're shunned during menstruation. And how can they even understand that? How can we even broach this topic if discussing what's going on with girls' bodies, with anyone's bodies, is so taboo? And so, if you look into the conceptual framework, I think you would find both ideas that are applicable to this issue. And some of them I mentioned briefly in the presentation. A core component of some of this work is we call girls' collectives. And lots of programs do girls groups and safe spaces and things like that. And that is very important. What we're trying to build on here is that what's maybe the distinction between a safe space group and girls collectives is that girls collectives are defined as a political space, meaning where girls start to learn about their bodies and understand, even just begin to be able to recognize and label things like gender inequality, discrimination, sexism, misogyny, along with other social issues, caste oppression, racism, things they might be experiencing in their lives that they've obviously felt and experienced, but maybe haven't understood how to name and sort of, understand, like, the problem isn't you, the problem is all of these other factors in society that are causing you to have these struggles, including, and this includes being able to discuss sexuality. So that is one example of a safe space where girls would be able to learn about their bodies and learn about sexuality, and maybe begin to understand, hey, the fact that I'm menstruating doesn't mean I should be, punished. And actually, there are very real things that would help me through this time of menstruation that I should be getting from the health system, from my family, from my school. And sort of that, that sort of start with like girls' perspectives and their own vision and aspiration. And then the other level, dialoguing with community and family members in ways that are culturally appropriate and led by local organizations. And sort of the same sort of let's tackle the taboo. Let's sort of break down some of these issues and in ways that are sort of aligned with local values, but also understanding how keeping girls from what they need is really not what, aligned with local values when you really sort of dig into things.
Thank you, Sarah. I do want to kind of piggyback off the point that you said, but we'll just go to the question on the chat and then I'll share a little bit of what you said. So we do have a question from Shiwani Agarwal. I think she said, I've been working in menstruation, sexuality, and womanhood space for a couple of years now. I was wondering if you have some recommendation on how to make this education more comprehensive in a way that it can be more inclusive and not just for different genders, but also for other intersectionalities, like PWD, people working in different sectors like contract workers.
So I would encourage, no, that's a great question and super important. I don't have I don't want to give a technical answer for how to bring in all of those perspectives here in the presentation, but there are definitely some resources out there that link to this, and I would be happy to send some, including the resources on the working group website. I know UNESCO has great resources on comprehensive sexuality education, and I think some other organizations do too. So I'm hoping some of their materials would be able to give you insight, and I would be happy to connect on that. Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Sarah. I think, Shivani, what we have your email from the chat. So what we can do is we'll email the PowerPoint presentation, and Sarah, if you give us some of the documents that you have, we can pass it on to her, which will be really useful to her. We do have another question from Joanna. Thank you, Joanna. It says, are there current examples of transformative approaches that are working? What are the 3 top game changers that have made the difference?
Thank you for that question. Yes, there are lots of examples, and again, I would be happy to share some research with you. Where I was most recently working was American Jewish World Service, which is an organization based here in the United States, and they do grant making to organizations in the global South working on some of these issues. With their funding, they funded many girls' collectives, particularly in India, also in the Dominican Republic and Kenya, and did an evaluation on what were those outcomes from girls' collectives and how did they differ from girls' groups that didn't take that political lens. And they found that girls' collectives were one of the most effective strategies within their the organizations that they were making grants to, precisely because they were able to shift girls' perspectives and girls' own understanding of what they deserved and what was possible for them in the world. And girls also were able to negotiate within their families to delay marriage, to stay in school, to have greater mobility in their communities, and also really confront some of the social issues in their communities, even ones that weren't related to child marriage. One thing that was interesting too is during COVID, some of these girls' collectives were on the front lines of getting protective equipment, getting food, and getting medicine to the most vulnerable people in those communities. And while that isn't necessarily a gendered issue, what was interesting was that because girls had been active in the collectives, their sort of notion of themselves as powerful people alone and together, they could address issues in sort of, this was unguided, unprompted by the organizations they were working with. This was their own initiative. And so just a signal of, girls' own activism and sort of how that leads to just their own understanding of what their role in the world is, and as a result, their visibility in the community. I don't think there's a short list, but there is also research showing that comprehensive sexuality education versus sex education that is not comprehensive, that doesn't address gender, that doesn't address power, the truly comprehensive sex education has much better outcomes for young people in terms of preventing unwanted pregnancies, in terms of avoiding violence, in terms of preventing STIs. And so there's some good research from Nicole Haberland on that. And I would just, in closing, to answer to this question, I know CARE USA ran a program called Tipping Point I think in Nepal, Bangladesh, and I think in one other country. They did a lot of evaluative work on what works to shift social norms, and that would be some other research that I would be able to send along.
Thank you, Sarah. Yeah, I just had a question from the PowerPoint as well. I think some of the focus group, the quotes, the girls had said that they don't want to feel ashamed. That's their the sun part of the diagram that you mentioned.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I think I just would like, if the research did come out with a conclusion or not, but what was the triggers, or why did the girls start feeling ashamed? Like, was there a certain trigger, or is this something from birth that they started feeling, or is it the influence of community? Just a bit more in depth around that. Yeah.
So the question was, why did girls start feeling shame?
Yeah, or like, is there a
Mhm.
certain age group that you kind of identified it started from?
Sure. I don't think I could pinpoint a certain age because I think girls' experiences in different places, even within each family, is so distinct. But what we really focused on is the transition into adolescence. Girls, how are you feeling within your family and with your community now, now that you're 13? And sort of what they told us, and it really, the the insights really varied too, interestingly, between Niger, Guatemala, and India, although there were a lot of commonalities. And so, for example, something I mentioned during the presentation was girls getting unwanted feedback on how they were dressed, and getting feedback on clothes that they felt comfortable in, but that were causing people to comment about them when they walked through town. Another issue was girls getting a lot of opinions from other people about who they were friends with, and being made to feel, especially if they were trying to have just simple friendships with boys, being told that that was wrong. And so it's shame is a sort of way of communicating to girls that what you're doing is putting you at risk of unwanted outcomes, instead of challenging why why are they at risk, why are they at risk of violence. It's not because, why is it about what they're wearing and not about who feels at liberty to enact violence on girls. So it's really sort of, if that goes unchallenged, everything starts to be the girl's fault.
I agree. And I
Mm-hmm.
think that kind of leads on very nicely, as if us girls and women, we're the ones always being pinpointed, what are we teaching the men and the boys? What are their roles in this
Mm-hmm.
scenario? So I think,
Mm-hmm.
I correct me if I'm wrong, I didn't just scan past the PowerPoint. Is there any key points where, so you said in the local communities is where you fund and then they work with the girls. Is there also projects where they work with boys and men? Because in the end, these young girls are getting married to men, hence the heterosexual marriage you were mentioning. So are they being given awareness that it's wrong, it shouldn't be done, or any sort of education around that, if you could tell us?
Absolutely. And we could even go to the rest of the hour talking about this issue. It's such an important one. It's, the idea of working with men and boys. It's not new, but it's often been a little bit divisive within feminist organizations, because some, have long said, why are we giving another dollar to working with men and boys? Even in resource poor settings, the men and boys are always going to get more than the women and girls. So we really want to focus on women and girls. But I think that mindset is really shifting towards really trying to understand what patriarchy does to people and what patriarchy does to society, and understand that men and boys have a place in that. Men and boys can experience disadvantages or the harmful effects of patriarchy. They'll always have it better than women and girls in that system. So I don't want to, have any misunderstanding there. But you're so right. I was in the Dominican Republic with a group of with a girls collective, and they had so much awareness about their bodies and their rights, and they were so strong. And I asked them how they felt about the boys in their communities, and they were like, oh no, want nothing to do with them. They just sit around, all they do is heckle us, they make inappropriate comments to us, they sit on their motorbikes, and they're not doing anything. And all I could think was, someone needs to come and work with these boys, because that is, they're just like steeping in in those patriarchal expectations of themselves. And so, yes, the conceptual framework does touch on that. And there are many organizations, both in the working group and outside of the working group, that are working on that. The YP Foundation is an organization in India that you might be familiar with. They really work with young people, and they really address the notion of masculinities and what does it mean to be a man and a boy in a patriarchal society, and how can men and boys start to understand the impacts of patriarchy on themselves, but also how that impacts girls and women in their lives, and sort of being really so different programming to raise their consciousness and help them understand how they can be better, how they can reject those patriarchal norms and contribute to better equality. So the YP Foundation and Equimundo, which used to be called Promundo, are two organizations that will have lots of resources to be on the working group on this issue.
Okay, thank you. Because I believe you did mention in the beginning that the research doesn't really touch much upon looking into how child marriage and menstruation kind of interlink in this research. But majority of the things that were mentioned about like shame, girls' freedom, they're kind of very interlinked with dignified menstruation, the lens that we're looking at from our organization, especially with the boys that you just mentioned. And then and through our research, what we've seen is it comes from around the age of 6 to 9. That's where the conditioning and society gets involved, and that's when they get witness, to the inequality up to the age of 6. So it's very interesting that there is a lot of links, and hopefully, there could be more work done in the future. Like you said, it is very complex, child marriage.
Right. And, but just to link that, I even remember in my own adolescence, my mom telling me, oh, put those away, put those tampons away. And you don't want your brothers to see them in the bathroom. And it's like, well, why not, Mom? They should learn that this is just a natural fact of girls and women's lives. It's not something that's a problem. It's just a fact. And I feel like I think throughout all societies that, we're encouraged to keep that hidden. And then it becomes a source of shame. It's as if something were wrong with us.
I think we do have one more question on the chat. It's just that why do funders hesitate to support organizations that are already working for a gender transformative perspective? How do we make the funding argument to them when they are largely responsible for keeping the social norm in place?
I really appreciate this question. And it goes back to the previous question of, can you show me 3 examples of gender transformative approaches that really work? And the reason why I link that is because traditionally, funders want cold, hard data, quantitative statistics that show unequivocally that their investment has made a change. And, funders are often sitting in places that are very far from the programs that they're funding. And what they're often really looking for are indicators, for example, age of marriage. How many girls avoided getting married before age 18 as a result of my funding? And they really want to see those numbers. But as we talked about before, gender transformative approaches aren't really focused so much on delaying marriage after a certain age as they are changing all of the deep social factors that are contributing to women's and girls' discrimination and disadvantage in any case. Delaying marriage will be one of those outcomes, but it might be that in a community, girls are expected to get married, let's say at age 13, and because of the program, they got married at age 17 and were able to stay in school and have more of a say of who their partner would be. And then that relationship is going to be different than it was if she got married at 17. But if we're just looking at age of marriage indicators and with 18 as the goal, that program might be considered a failure, even though it has given that girl so much more options in life. And so I think because the gender transformative approaches, it's just harder to measure quantitatively. The successes might be described in more qualitative terms. It's really social change work, which isn't always linear. Sometimes you make progress and then there's backlash and you have to sort of, reconsider your strategy about how to move forward. So in short, I would say it's harder to have a crisp, clean picture of the change, of what change is happening from the viewpoint of donors. And so what we ask of donors is, and this can be very difficult for some donors because it can be hard to make change in funding institutions, is to learn more about these approaches, to learn more about these drivers of child marriage, and to understand that not all of the solutions are going to be able to be communicated to them in such quantitative and reductive ways. And, you know, some of the girls' organizations that I've worked with before have encouraged donors, please come visit our work. You know, please, you know, come see what we're doing so you can understand the complexity of what the context and the changes they're trying to achieve. And that can help donors have, you know, understand that that it's not so easy and it's not so black and white.
No, I agree. I think it's not always so quantitative. Social change is a lot about qualitative measures, and that's something that we can't put in numbers. And yeah, but thank you, Sarah, for that. I would like to just let everybody know we do have 10 more minutes. If there is any questions, we do have one. Says, as someone who has been aware of this issue but not really involved in any movement, what can we do to support this cause? I think that's a great question.
Thank you. Well, I'm going to answer this without knowing what kind of organization that the Priya works for, what her position is. And I will say, if you look at the resources from the Sexuality Working Group, we do have clear recommendations for different stakeholders. So researchers and evaluators, program implementers, funders, and others. So that would be I think that could be useful to answering your question too. I would say if you're implementing programs and you're not sure if they're, you know, being gender transformative or recognizing all of these power dynamics and really addressing them, I think the recommendation would be to learn more about it, to understand more deeply what it means to take a gender transformative approach, and take a look at some documentation of programs that are doing this, and try and just, you know, understand how that relates to what you're doing and how you might be able to adopt and adapt some of what you're doing to address these issues. If you're a researcher, I think just to our previous point, being able to do research and evaluation that really gets at these gender transformative root cause qualitative approaches, and being able to communicate the successes and lessons learned from those. And of course, I think the funding recommendations are clear. I know, Ninama, there was a question about the law earlier that I thought was interesting. I'm scrolling up. I don't know if it's from Shivani.
Oh, I think she was saying regarding my question about the age factor. Is there a certain age where girls start feeling shame? She also said, what role does the socio-economic condition play in this?
Oh, I'm looking at
was it not that one?
I'm sorry to be advocating to answer one question, but it's so related to, there's one where she says, I wanted to understand if there's been an example of understanding of how child marriage prohibition laws are neglected, and what are some ways to ensure implementation of such laws. Would you mind if we gave a little focus to that?
No, go for it.
Yeah, thank you. And the reason why I wanted to push for that is because that is where the working group is focused now. We are starting to partner with different civil society organizations and the UN to convene a global dialogue on age of marriage laws. And the reason why we're doing that is, you know, to answer some of this good and complex question from Shivani is, how do we make laws work better for girls and women? Because like I pointed out earlier, despite the long existence of laws, in India, which is where Shivani is pointing to, and in Nepal and other places, child marriage has persisted. And when there's not abundant research on that evaluates child marriage laws. Laws are hard to evaluate, like what their impact has been. But the research that has been done shows very little causality, doesn't really show a causal link between passing an age of marriage law and reductions in child marriage. And in India in particular, I'd be excited to share this research with you too. There's been Partners for Law and Development has really looked at how the Child Marriage Prohibition Act has affected girls and women in society, in particular, how that law in conjunction with POCSO, to prevent child sexual abuse, and some other laws, have actually been used to restrict girls and young people's choices instead of protecting them. So I think we have a lot to learn to understand. We have a law. What good can it really do? How can it be better communicated and implemented to protect girls and give them more choice? And what kinds of laws would result in less punitive approaches for vulnerable, for the most marginalized? Because we also know that even when laws try to protect girls by punishing those who arrange a child marriage, it's often the parents and communities that are living in poverty or lower caste and more marginalized in society that get that punishment. The wealthier, more connected families don't, right? So, and that's, we're doing some work now to understand, and obviously laws function very differently in different countries and different communities, trying to understand what might be some common threads that would make laws more useful and more supportive to girls and women. So thanks for letting me speak to that. Oh, now you're muted.
Sorry, press the chat button just to double check there was no questions. I think we do have a little bit of a statement from Radha just saying how discriminatory menstrual practice is rampant in various forms and plays a vital role to contract and reinforce the patriarchy. But menstrual discrimination is a missing driver for children marriage caused globally. I mean, do you have any opinions on that? I mean, I know in the PowerPoint, lack of freedom, I believe, was one of the most powerful drivers for child marriage. But what are your thoughts on discriminative menstruation could be, I mean, it wasn't in the research, but could be one of the driving factors?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's very much intertwined because it's sort of when girls' bodies enter that stage, when girls enter that stage of life of puberty, sexuality, and whether it's like the bodily functions related to menstruation or the possible act of sex and all of those things, they come, that creates problems for girls. You know, society, families, schools, health systems, boys, they start to see girls and young women in a different way. And for the most part, it's not good. It's girls are a risk, girls are a problem. Oh, girls are going to go get pregnant. Oh, girls are having their period and we don't know how to deal with that. We feel all kinds of, shame and have taboos around all of that. And how all of that restricts girls and women's freedom. It disrespects their bodies and autonomy. And it's also combined with the failure to give women and girls what they need to navigate this time of life. Instead of shunning girls or making them feel bad about what's happening to their body, we should be educating them, ourselves, our neighbors, the boys and men in our lives that, hey, this is happening. This is healthy and normal. And this is what girls need now that they've entered puberty, and it's nothing to be ashamed of. And so how much menstrual discrimination is exactly a driver, but we can see how all of these social norms are interlinked to manifest in negative ways for girls.
I think it definitely plays a part in it, but that's something we need to definitely, research further because there is a lot of similarities. Which then now leads me to closing. I think we've had a wonderful discussion, a great dialogue. Thank you, Sarah, and Radha, of course, for your time and expertise today. It was a fruitful dialogue and something that needs to be had and, of course, definitely continued until child marriage is eliminated and hopefully menstruation can be dignified as well. I would like to thank everybody that attended today and took part and interacted. Thank you so much. Lastly, I would like to inform everyone about 8th of December. It is recognized as International Dignified Menstruation Day. This year would be our 6th year. The focus this year is on upholding dignified menstruation, fundamental to sexual and reproductive health and rights. It will be taking place in Boston, USA, but also can be accessible virtually. So if anybody would like any information on that, please connect with us through our social or give us an email. But that's everything. If there is any last queries, please email us. I'm sure we can feedback to Sarah and go back and forth on that round. But thank you, Sarah, for your time. And thank you, Joanne, for your translation, even though I didn't really hear you, but I'm sure you've been working very hard in the background. Thank you, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you so
Bye-bye.
much.